What's going on, everybody? It's your boy John. Here we go. Last two chapters. So, if you've been following along, we've gone through 9 chapters so far, where we basically went over Beethoven's life 9 times. Because this is called the Variations on a Life. So, these last 2 times that we go over Beethoven's life, I think the last 2 chapters are the best. You'll have to let me know what you think. So here we go. Chapter 10. The Music. Beethoven wrote in virtually every genre of his time. Symphonies, concertos, overtures, sonatas of all kinds, trios, quartets, quintets, and larger chamber ensembles, songs, oratorio, opera, and sacred music. Listeners today enjoy easy access to program notes that describe individual works in detail. Broader perspectives that transcend specific works can help us understand the music at a still deeper level. Even something as seemingly simple as the way in which Beethoven numbered his own works, for example, has much to tell us about the composer's perception of what he wrote. Although he had published a fair number of pieces by the middle of the 1790s, he waited quite deliberately before conferring the portentous designation Opus 1 on anything he had written. The label opus, Latin for work, abbreviated as OP, that would have been useful in chapter 1, if all this time he's been saying Opus 135, 132, 131, Opus 19. That would have been nice if they told us from the get-go, Opus stands for the Latin word for work, abbreviated as OP. So back to Bonds. The label Opus carried real weight, and the 3 piano trios of Opus 1, issued in July 1795, are easily his most substantial pieces to that point. Large 4-movement works dedicated to his principal patron at the time, Prince Lichnowsky. Beethoven then waited another 9 months before releasing anything he considered worthy of bearing the label of Opus 2. This is an equally weighty collection of 3 piano sonatas dedicated to his teacher, Joseph Haydn. In the meantime, he had continued to issue further small-scale works without opus numbers, mostly piano variations and orchestral dances. This pattern would continue throughout his life, works designated by opus numbers interspersed with what we consider lesser ones, to which scholars have since assigned arbitrary WO big O numbers, short for Werk ohne Opuszahl, which means works without opus numbers. These works without opus numbers are by no means necessarily of lesser quality, however. The set of 12 variations for piano and cello, whoa, I don't even know how to say that. I'm just gonna say woo. The set of 12 variations for piano and cello, woo, 45. On the chorus, See the Conquering Hero Comes from Handel's oratorio Judas Maccabeus, for example, is every bit the equal of later variations issued with opus numbers, in terms of both scale and the demands it makes on performers. Published in Arteria of Vienna in 1797, it is dedicated to Princess Maria Christiane von Lichnowsky, the wife of the same patron to whom Beethoven had dedicated the piano trios Opus 1. Why no opus number, then? Variations were regarded as a genre of lesser prestige than sonatas or piano trios. Not until 1803, with the piano variations Opus 34 and Opus 35, did Beethoven issue a set of variations with an opus number. These were on themes of his own invention, and in a letter to Breitkopf of December 1802, he called attention to his desire to release each of these 2 sets with a, quote, proper number within my greater musical works, End quote. Beethoven was in fact one of the first composers to exert a reasonable control over the numbering of his own works, so that with occasional exceptions, an opus number reflects a given composer's date of publication, not when they were done, right? But what did these works mean? Did they in fact mean anything at all? Or as one anonymous critic asked in the summer of 1827, just a few months before Beethoven's death, quote, "Should one think about something while listening to instrumental music?" End quote. These are age-old questions, and they still resonate today. Listeners have always been able to relate a work of vocal music to the text being sung, but hearing music that has no words of any kind and whose title is literally generic, like Symphony No. 2 or Sonata in C major, creates a different kind of challenge. Beethoven himself had to walk a fine line on this point. On the one hand, he gave descriptive titles to, or at least some of his instrumental works, such as the Eroica and the Pastoral Symphonies, the Pathétique, and Les Adieux piano sonatas. At times, he even went as far as to give individual movements their own titles, as in the Funeral March, the second movement of the Eroica Symphony, the Funeral March on the Death of a Hero, the second movement of the Piano Sonata Opus 26, and the Awakening of Happy Feelings Upon Arriving in the Countryside, known as the first movement of the Pastoral Symphony. I highly recommend that symphony. It is simply the best. Back to Bonds. He knew that critics had long regarded tone painting, the depiction of real-world sounds through music such as battles, frogs croaking, and birds singing, as music of a lower order. But oddly enough, and in the Pastoral no less, he took pains to identify the species of bird calls presented toward the end of its second movement. Nightingale, cuckoo, and quail. Yes. So that's kind of an interesting thing where Beethoven was basically like, I don't like making real world things, but at the same time, he created some great stuff that has some real world ties, right? Back to Bonds. Listeners were sometimes forgiving in such instances, sometimes not. They greeted Wellington's victory enthusiastically at first, no doubt because of the wave of patriotism sweeping Austria at the time. But many of them later found the same work embarrassing, precisely because the depictions of cannon and musket fire left so little to the imagination. Still, clues to what works might be about were always welcome, even if they were second-hand. The composer's alleged description of the opening of the Fifth Symphony as fate pounding at the portal, for example, came from the unreliable Anton Schindler long after the fact. Schindler also reported that the composer had connected the piano sonata in D minor, Opus 31, No. 2, with Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Right. Another great piano sonata in D minor, Opus 31, No. 2, The Tempest. Great sonata. We cannot dismiss such testimony out of hand. The more reliable Ferdinand Ries recalled that his teacher frequently had a certain subject in mind when he composed, and his fellow pupil Czerny suggested as much as well. The sketches occasionally confirm such an approach. An early draft for the string quartet in F major, Opus 18, No. 1, for example, shows that Beethoven was thinking of the tomb scene of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet while composing the slow movement, which he marked Adagio affettuoso ed appassionato, translated to slowly but with loving feeling and passionately. In the end, however, Beethoven rarely gave clues about what images or stories might have inspired him. The dramatic nature of so many of the composer's well-known works has certainly tempted many listeners to create narratives of their own that match the music. The wordless marital spat between Sid Caesar and Nanette Fabre in a December 1954 airing of the television variety show Caesar's Hour, perhaps some of you know that show, played against the first movement of the Fifth Symphony is both hilarious and revealing. Gestures, facial expressions, and body language suffice. No words are needed. At the very beginning, we see a close-up of opposing accusatory hands thrust forward against the famous opening motif, first his, then hers. The camera pans out and the pace picks up. We see a brief moment of reconciliation with the entrance of the lyrical theme in E-flat major. Recriminations resume with the development. Energy flags toward the end of the development, followed by the most vehement recriminations of all at the beginning of the recapitulation. One last futile effort at forgiveness is mimed against the plaintive, unexpected oboe solo, but then abandoned when the orchestra resumes full throttle. The skit concludes with a final resolution to the sound of the march-like theme that closes out the movement. The two comedians have tapped brilliantly into the essentially dramatic nature of the music. Is this movement about a marital spat? Of course not, but it is about conflict of some kind. The sticking point is always the degree of specificity. In a widely discussed essay first published in 1985, the music historian Owen Yonder, maybe it's Yonder, proposed that the middle movement of the Fourth Piano Concerto depicts Orpheus in the underworld, pleading his case before Pluto and Proserpina for the return of his beloved Eurydice. In Yonder's reading, the harsh, angular outbursts of the orchestra represent the gods of the underworld, while Beethoven makes his case with the piano, a simulacrum of the mythic figure's lyre. The two engage in dialogue, and the orchestra's wrath gradually subsides, mirroring, as Yonder argues, the process by which the gods fall into a trance. After a passage of high tension, repeated trills and runs on the piano, we hear a moment of miraculous transformation as Orpheus, still alive, passes into the realm of the dead. Beethoven's own representation of himself as Orpheus in Mahler's portrait of him gives further support to this reading. So here's a portrait of Beethoven. You don't often see Beethoven's face like this, but he looks very different in this photograph for you audio listeners, because you kind of always see Beethoven with some longer hair, but here he has some shorter hair here. It looks like a pretty young Beethoven in 1804. Back to Bonds. Even those who reject the specificity of Yonder's scenario concede that the orchestra and piano are engaged in a dialogue of some sort, and that the piano, in its own pleading way, eventually wins out by subduing the orchestra. But is the music really about this specific situation, or is it only about itself, which is to say, the play of opposing musical forces? Reasonable minds continue to disagree on this point. Titles can tell us something even when they are literally generic. symphony, string quartet, and sonata. They identify and allow us to anticipate not only the performance forces of the work at hand, but also its general formal outline. A symphony, for example, is a work for full orchestra and typically consists of 4 movements: a fast first movement in sonata form, a slow movement in a different key, a lively minuet or scherzo movement in the tonic and triple meter, 3 beats to the measure, and a fast finale, most often in rondo or sonata form. The same pattern holds for many genres of chamber music, with only 1 player per part, and piano sonatas, though the minuet scherzo movement is sometimes absent from these. These conventions are by no means immutable. The pastoral symphony consists of 5 movements, and the 9th incorporates vocal soloists and a chorus in its finale. Oftentimes, the pastoral symphony in recordings come out as 4 movements because one of the movements is very short. It's the lightning movement. Yeah, that one's only like a minute and a half, so it's sometimes incorporated into the 3rd movement. But that movement is so intense. Back to bonds. Yet even these exceptions operate within a still broader convention of what might be called a genre's tone. For Beethoven's generation and well beyond, the symphony was the most prestigious of all instrumental genres, the one in which composers could most readily demonstrate their command of orchestration in large-scale form. It was also among the least commercially attractive. Consumers who would readily buy piano and chamber music were not in the market for works that required an ensemble of 40 or more players. They might purchase arrangements of symphonies, most commonly for piano, piano duo, 4 hands, or piano trio with piano, violin, and cello, but not the original works themselves. That Beethoven wrote as many symphonies as he did is in itself remarkable, given the changing nature of the musical scene in Vienna at the time. Whereas Haydn had written more than 100 of them, mostly for his orchestra at the Esterhazy court and then later at Paris and London, Beethoven had no orchestra readily at his disposal. In 1800, the year of his first symphony, Vienna could offer very few truly public concerts, that is, concerts open to anyone who could afford a ticket of admission. Even these were mostly ad hoc affairs. There was no standing civic orchestra, and regular concert series would not appear on the scene for another decade or more. In brackets, in a revealing coincidence, the Vienna Philharmonic and the New York Philharmonic were both founded in the same year of 1842. That's pretty neat. Which kind of means that, yeah, in Europe, philharmonics were just not that important pretty much until, a couple of years before the American Civil War. So that's very telling. Back to bonds. There is no quintessential Beethoven symphony. Each has its own distinct profile, especially from the 3rd onward. The Eroica is truly revolutionary, not only because of its sheer size, but also because of its structural complexity, its sonorities, and the weight of its finale, and what might be called its ethical dimension. It wrestles with the ideas of heroism, struggle, death, and victory. Even without the subtitle, The Heroic Symphony, and the cancelled Dedication to Napoleon, listeners of the time would have readily recognized the first movement's opening theme as a military-style horn call and the second movement as a funeral march. The latter raises issues of life and death in a genre that until then had been perceived largely as a vehicle of entertainment, not of moral or philosophical ideas. But the simulated sound of muffled drums at the beginning of the march and the gradual slowing down of the clock-like rhythm toward the end combine to remind us of human mortality. With the eroica, instrumental music in general, and the symphony in particular, began to move beyond the realm of mere pleasure. From a more technical perspective, Beethoven's innovations in the formal design of his symphonies extend from the level of the individual movement to the cycle as a whole. His addition of vocal soloists and chorus in the finale of the Ninth Symphony is merely the most striking of the many ways in which he explored fundamentally new approaches to the genre. Again, he liked to look at a single object, in this case the genre of the symphony, from multiple perspectives. The Fourth Symphony features a slow introduction of unprecedented gravity and length, offset by a rollicking first movement that gives extraordinary prominence to the timpani. In this work, Beethoven also began to explore in depth the possibility of linking all four movements through a particular intervallic motif, B-flat to G-flat. He would take up the same challenge in a different way in the Fifth Symphony, which explores way of linking all four movements through the transformation of a prominent rhythmic motif, short, 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 long, and through the return of one movement, the third, within the course of another, the fourth. So I totally agree that especially in the Third Symphony, you get kind of this idea that it's one story, but they have chapters. But by the time you get to the Fifth Symphony, you see more thematic ties. So it's not like individual chapters. It kind of spills over a bit more. But as it's about to say, the Sixth Symphony is a very good mix of both, where it's one story with distinct chapters, but you can tell very well that it is the same work. So, back to Bonds. The Sixth Pastoral Symphony is an example of what has come to be known as program music, instrumental music that seeks to convey ideas, images, or events through sound with the aid of a descriptive title, movement titles, or a more elaborate prose program. The seventh, perhaps the most popular of all Beethoven's symphonies during the 19th century, eschews programmatic headings but explores the element of rhythm with unparalleled intensity. True. If you've watched my Beethoven videos, the first one is like how does the first one go? That's the first movement. You find that rhythm going throughout that whole thing. The second movement is the dum 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 dum. The third movement is and then the fourth one is it's an incredibly rhythmic work. It's great. Oh, I've been singing a lot more in this episode, huh? Okay. Richard Wagner would later call it, the Seventh Symphony, the apotheosis of dance. The eighth, often overshadowed by its larger siblings, is a biting essay in humor and irony. The ninth, in turn, raised symphonic monumentality to unprecedented heights, both in its length and in its incorporation of sung text in its finale. This was a move that would spark tremendous controversy in the decades that followed, but even detractors agreed that after Beethoven, the symphony was fundamentally new. The composers could now, in effect, philosophize in music. In addition to symphonies, Beethoven wrote about a dozen single-movement works for orchestra. Some of these, like the Egmont King Stephen, Ruins of Athens, Consecration of the House, were overtures to spoken dramas for which he wrote incidental music as well. Others, like the Coriolanus and Name Day, were written expressly for the concert hall with no opera or drama to follow. Beethoven ultimately rejected the three overtures to the Opera Lenore in favor of the one for the renamed Fidelio. The third of the Lenore overtures, Opus 72b, would become a standalone favorite in the concert hall. With the exception of the Name Day Overture Opus 115, originally conceived as an overture for any occasion or for use in a concert, all of these works reflect in some way the emotional worlds of the dramas with which they are connected. In this way, they are important forerunners of the symphonic poems or tone poems by such later composers as Franz Liszt and Richard Strauss. But it was through the piano that Beethoven established his reputation, and the piano concerto was the ideal vehicle for him to showcase his talents both as a composer and performer. By the premiere of the last of the five piano concertos in 1811, however, growing deafness had forced him to cede the role of soloist to his student, Archduke Rudolph. Wow, that's actually pretty impressive that Archduke Rudolph could play those piano concertos, which he did mention that Archduke Rudolph was a very good pianist earlier on. In this same work, later nicknamed the Emperor Concerto because of its size and grandeur, Beethoven broke with convention in the first movement by instructing the soloist to play a written-out cadenza rather than the expected improvisation of the performer's own making. The violin concerto, in turn, remains a staple of the repertory, as does the triple concert for piano, violoncello, and orchestra. The 32 piano sonatas were central to the sole repertory of that instrument and spanned the whole of Beethoven's career. Like the symphonies, they explore an astonishing variety of styles. Most are in 3 or 4 movements, some in only 2. With only a few exceptions, all are far more technically demanding than what was customary at the time. This undoubtedly cut into sales and helped foster Beethoven's reputation as a difficult composer. The late sonatas, Opus 101, 106, 109, 110, 111, specifically, are especially challenging. Opus 106, nicknamed the Hammerklavier, has been called the Mount Everest of the piano because of its size and technical difficulty, particularly its fugal finale. Although overshadowed by the piano sonatas to some extent, the 10 sonatas for violin and piano and the 5 sonatas for cello and piano are every bit as ambitious and wide-ranging. The Kreutzer Sonata for violin and piano, Opus 47, known by its dedication to a virtuoso of that name, has won particular renown. So Kreutzer has actually a lot of good etudes and a lot of great little pieces that are very good. Very, very instructive for your intermediate, advanced players. The last 2 cello sonatas, Opus 102, in turn, are important examples of the composer's late style. Beethoven also wrote 6 piano trios for piano, violin, cello, 5 string trios, violin, viola, cello, and various other chamber works in a variety of combinations for strings, winds, and piano. Beethoven cultivated the genre of variations throughout his life. His first published work, in fact, was a set of keyboard variations on a march tune issued in 1782. Woo! 63. The themes he varied in these early years were sometimes of his own invention, but more often taken from other composers, including several by Mozart and one by his Bonn patron, Count Waldstein. Later in life, he preferred to create variations on his own themes, as in the Variations for Piano, Opus 35, which would later become the basis for the finale of the Eroica Symphony. Some of his variations are independent works, which often function as individual movements within larger works, such as the middle movement of the Appassionata Sonata for Piano, Opus 57. The monumental Diaboli Variations, Opus 120, published in 1823, constitute a veritable encyclopedia of variation techniques. In 1819, Anton Diabelli, a Viennese composer and publisher, had invited a number of his contemporaries, including Schubert, Czerny, and Archduke Rudolph, as well as Beethoven, to contribute one variation for piano on a brief waltz melody of Diabelli's own invention. In his characteristic way, Beethoven turned the simple melody inside out and upside down, showing its potential in multiple ways through no fewer than 33 variations. The penultimate one, an enormous fugue. Beethoven also wrote variations for various chamber combinations as well, including cello and piano, violin and piano trio. Like the violin sonatas, the 16-string quartets for 2 violins, viola, and cello span the composer's entire creative career. This was the most prestigious of all chamber music genres, in part because of the remarkable repertory of string quartets by Haydn and Mozart. Beethoven must have been particularly self-conscious about his place within this lineage when he issued his set of 6 string quartets, Opus 18, in 1801. He modeled his quartet Opus 18 No. 5 in A major on Mozart's quartet K464 in the same key, an unusual act of homage that is at the same time competitive, in that it openly invites comparison of the two works. The next 3 quartets, published in 1808 as Opus 59, are altogether different, larger, more difficult, and full of the heroic style we associate with the Beethoven of the 3rd and 5th symphonies. The 3 works of Opus 59 as a whole are known as the Razumovsky Quartets, by virtue of their dedicatee, the Russian ambassador to the Austrian Empire, who at the time was one of Beethoven's more important patrons. All of the subsequent quartets were substantial enough to be issued individually. The group of 5 late quartets, you know which ones, constitute some of the most demanding music of the 19th century, both technically and aesthetically. Indeed, for much of the 19th century and for some time into the 20th, these works were more respected than loved. Many critiques regarded them as unfortunate manifestations of Beethoven's extreme sense of isolation from the external world. These works have since come to be valued as probing explorations of the human psyche and have proven an inexhaustible source of inspiration for any number of later composers, including such diverse figures as Arnold Schoenberg, Bela Bartok, Igor Stravinsky, Elliott Carter, and Georges Rochberg. I mean, to be fair, what he just said about his late quartets is still true today. People don't like them, but they still respect the technicalities required to do it. Like, those late quartets are for professionals only, really. You will not see amateurs try and do that and succeed at it. Back to Bonds. Beethoven wrote a great deal more of vocal music than most people realize. Two settings of the Mass Ordinary, an oratorio, Christ on the Mount of Olives, an opera, Fidelio, several secular cantatas, and miscellaneous works for soloists, chorus, and orchestra, more than 100 songs and individual arias, some 180 folk song arrangements, and almost 50 canons for various numbers of voices. Given this vast quantity of music, it must have galled on him to read his contemporaries consistently stipulate their praise for him as the greatest living composer of instrumental music. I'm going to read that again. I read that wrong. Given this vast quantity of music, it must have galled him to read his contemporaries consistently stipulate their praise for him as the greatest living composer of instrumental music. In fairness to those contemporaries, this was not so much a criticism of his vocal writing as a recognition of his unique genius for instrumental works. Setting a text to music, as one anonymous critic of the Opus 75 songs argued in 1811, actually, quote, inhibited Beethoven because it deprived him of the, quote again, broad, free field of play he needed to display his creative gifts to the fullest. Beethoven would have gladly written more operas under the right circumstances, which is to say, a commission from an opera house, and given the right libretto. He was constantly on the search for a good text and dreamed of setting Goethe's Faust to music. One can only imagine what a partnership of two of the greatest artists of the time might have produced. In the end, however, he completed only one, Fidelio, in 1814, which began life as Lenore in 1805. 9 years? 9 years? Wow. The libretto is an adaptation of a French drama that tells the story of a woman who disguises herself as a man and secures employment in a prison in order to free her husband, Florestan, who has been unjustly incarcerated because of his political beliefs. The so-called Third Lenore Overture is a brilliant encapsulation of the plot for instruments alone. It was so powerful, in fact, that it effectively overwhelmed the stage action that followed, and Beethoven wisely wrote a more concise overture and published the earlier one separately. With its theme of personal liberty and freedom of thought, Fidelio features many moving passages, most notably the contemplative quartet of Act 1, in which the four characters on stage sing their own monologues simultaneously, the kind of thing that is simply not possible in spoken drama. Famously said in Amadeus, the film, that basically somebody told Mozart that it would be impossible to have 8 people singing at the same time and people to understand, but Mozart said, it's actually easy to tell what 8 people are saying if they're singing their own line of music. And so that shows up here is that for some reason our brains can follow more conversations in words if they have their own musical lines. So isn't that kind of amazing? Back to Bonds. Beethoven was also constantly on the lookout for poems to set as songs for voice and piano. His poets included such leading figures as Goethe, Schiller, and Herder, but also many less known ones as well. Subjects range from the comical, as in Urian's Reise um die Welt, Urian's Journey Around the World, to the serious, as in Liebe, Unreciprocal Love, whose melody provided the basis for the conclusion of the choral fantasy, in many ways adumbrated the Ode to Joy melody of the Ninth Symphony. He created the first true song cycle with An die ferne Geliebte, Opus 98, a series of 6 songs that flow seamlessly without interruption. In 1809, Beethoven began a decade-long engagement with the Edinburgh publisher George Thomson to make a series of arrangements for voice, violin, cello, and a piano of English, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh folk songs. Thomson specified that each setting was to open with a brief instrumental introduction, and the composer obliged by developing some portion of the melody put before him. Quite aside from the good income these settings brought in, Beethoven must have enjoyed the challenge of harmonizing melodies that do not always conform to the standard system of major and minor. There is not one that does not bear the stamp of genius, knowledge, and taste, Thomson wrote to Beethoven of one set of his songs. That was a quote. Another quote. What a delightful little conversations between the violin and violoncello. End quote. He grumbled on more than one occasion, however, that the instrumental parts, particularly for the piano, were too technically difficult for some amateurs. So I believe the time that he was over there working with the Edinburgh publisher, that's when he started work on the violin concerto, I believe. The only completed liturgical works are the two settings of the Mass Ordinary, Opus 86, commissioned by Prince Nikolaus II Esterhazy, and the Missa Solemnis, Opus 123, written for the installation of Archduke Rudolf as Archbishop of Olmütz in 1820, but not completed until 1823. In both works, especially the latter one, Beethoven went to extraordinary lengths to inform himself of the exact diction of the Latin words and the liturgical traditions of the Mass. Indeed, he declared that his, quote, primary goal, end quote, in writing the Missa Solemnis had been to, quote, arouse religious feelings and make them lasting in singers and listeners alike, end quote. The sketchbooks preserve a number of other attempts at sacred works for which no immediate demand is known. And finally, the canons, the briefest of all Beethoven's works. Many of them are known only through letters to friends, where they are appended as gifts or mementos. The texts are often humorous and involve some sort of wordplay. The three-voice canon, Cool nix lau, cool, not lukewarm, woo, 191, for example, puns on the name of its recipient, the Danish composer Friedrich Kuhlau. Cool nicht lau, cool not lukewarm, for his Danish friend Friedrich Kuhlau. Canons are rather like self-made crossword puzzles. The challenge is to create a theme that can be sung or played against itself with voices entering in succession. Beethoven's works are preserved in written scores, but they live in performance. And although every realization of those scores is necessarily different, traditions of performance have changed remarkably over time. I think the light's too bright that I'm getting blinded. 19th century conductors like Richard Wagner and Gustav Mahler felt free to adjust the orchestration of the symphonies to accommodate the much larger concert halls of their day, even going so far as to add a tuba to the finale of the Ninth Symphony. This practice continued well into the 20th century. The historically informed performance practice movement that rose to prominence in the 1970s has taken precisely the opposite approach. Groups like Roger Norrington's London Classical Players and John Eliot Gardner's Orchestra Révolutionnaire et Romantique use period instruments that differ remarkably from those of today's modern orchestras. All the instruments of Beethoven's time have been modified to varying degrees, and orchestras and concert halls were in any case much smaller, So the experience of hearing familiar works like the symphonies played by ensembles that more nearly resemble those of earlier times can be revelatory. Textures are typically far more transparent, with individual lines standing out in greater relief. Tempos also tend to be far livelier, sometimes radically so. Norrington's 1987 recording of the slow movement of the Ninth Symphony, for example, runs just over 11 minutes, whereas the legendary 1954 Bayreuth recordings by Wilhelm Furtwängler clocks at 19 and a half minutes. Such extreme contrasts have led scholars to question whether it is in fact the same piece. Pianos have changed as well. The modern instrument is far larger and louder. Its counterparts in Beethoven's time produced a sound that was more focused, less mushy, as its proponents would say. The mechanisms of the two instruments also differ significantly. This compels pianists to use a lighter touch on the fortepiano, as the older instrument was known. But even these earlier instruments vary widely in size, tone, and range, and in the end, there is no one correct instrument, new or old, for Beethoven's keyboard works. Each can help us hear these works in new ways, and the artistry of the performer remains paramount, for in the end, a score is a script waiting to be brought to life. Wonderful. Chapter 11. Beethoven. A secret compartment of Beethoven's writing desk, discovered and opened shortly after his death, amounted to nothing less than a time capsule, for it was there that he had buried the two documents that have since contributed most to his posthumous image, which might be thought as Beethoven, the Heiligenstadt Testament and the letter to the immortal beloved. These were messages, in effect, from beyond the grave, and they gave the composer a human face, one beset by physical and mental pain. When the Heiligenstadt Testament was published for the first time in October 1827, it convinced the musical public beyond all doubt that understanding Beethoven the individual was the key to understanding his music. The revelation that his art alone had held him back from suicide electrified critics and gave them more than enough reason to justify hearing his life in his works. The public now knew that the composer himself had linked his suffering to his art. Biographical interpretations of the music became the new norm almost at once. One critic, commenting on the Ninth Symphony a year after the composer's death, identified Beethoven's suffering as a source of strength. It was these trials that had enabled him to create, quote, a complete portrait of his soul, end quote. For the ninth was his autobiography when written in music. The noted Berlin critic Adolf Bernhard Marx, in turn, heard in the string quartet in F major, opus 135, quote, the deepest, innermost soul of the composer in all its richness and of sentiment, an outpouring of memories and sorrows. End quote. As more and more evidence of Beethoven's life came to light, the scowl grew ever more severe. It's going all full circle here. Anton Schindler's 1840 biography reinforced it, for he had experienced it firsthand, or so he claimed, as the composer's on and off personal assistant in the 1920s. Schindler was the first to publish the letter to the immortal beloved, another relic of personal suffering. No wonder his readers accepted at face value his report of the composer's explanation of the opening of the Fifth Symphony as fate pounding at the portal. The idea of autobiographical music inspired the generation of composers who came of age in Beethoven's wake. They recognized that while they could not imitate his style, they could readily promote their music as a projection of their own inner selves. Hector Berlioz encouraged listeners to hear a Symphonie Fantastique episode in The Life of an Artist as a portrayal of his unhappy affair with the Irish actress Harriet Smithson, and he made sure that the Parisian press knew about the work's backstory. Robert Schumann wrote himself into his music in several ways, using a veil of easily decoded musical ciphers in his Carnaval for piano to portray himself and his circle of friends. Franz Liszt depicted his travels throughout Europe by associating the names of specific places with a number of his works for piano. Richard Wagner called attention to his personal experience of a storm at sea as the inspiration for the overture to The Flying Dutchman. Critics consequently began to assume that all music, or at least all instrumental music, was somehow autobiographical. They heard Chopin's mazurkas and polonaises as outpourings of patriotism for their creator's native Poland. Bedřich Smetana was quite explicit when he gave his String Quartet No. 1 the subtitle From My Life, and glossed the opening of its finale as a recreation of the high-pitched ringing that signaled the onset of his deafness. By this point, however, a noted Viennese critic could complain that, quote, a composer could actually write From My Life above from each of his pieces of music, because from where should we otherwise take his music unless he steals it? True. Smetana is also great. You can hear through a lot of his string quartets some real painful stuff, like after he lost his wife, and then like I think within the next year he lost his daughter or something. He wrote some really intense string quartets, and by that time he was like fairly deaf already, so it was like, yeah, it's very Beethovenian, as this book would say. Beethovenian. Back to Bonds. Closely related to the belief that instrumental music could be autobiographical was the expectation that music without words could engage with philosophical and even metaphysical ideas. Composers and critics alike looked to Beethoven as a model, particularly to each works as the Eroica Symphony, about heroism, the Pastoral Symphony, about nature, and the Fifth Symphony, about fate, if Schindler's report is to be believed, and it was. Wagner, on the other hand, argued that Beethoven had recognized the expressive limits of purely instrumental music and had shown the way toward the music of the future in the Ninth Symphony by introducing voices and text in the finale. The Ninth finale thus became an aesthetic battleground between those who, like Wagner, considered it a blueprint for the future of the art, and those who considered it an aberration, a one-time experiment Beethoven had pursued no further. The conductor Hans von Bülow, who allied himself with the latter group, consistently performed the Ninth without its finale. Wow. The like-minded Johannes Brahms, in turn, conducted the finale of his own First Symphony, around a theme that blatantly evokes the Ode to Joy melody precisely in order to emphasize his own work's exclusive reliance on instruments alone. No wonder, then, that von Bülow would call Brahms' First Beethoven's 10th. Yes. Kind of amazing. I think Brahms is such a pivotal person that really made music way more complicated, and kind of paved the way for Mahler to make it even more complicated. In the meantime, Beethoven was becoming monumental. An enormous statue of the composer went up in 1845 in the main square of Bonn, his birthplace. Others soon followed. They all scowl. The one in Vienna by the sculptor Caspar Clemens von Zumbusch, erected in 1880, literally looks down on us. More remarkable still is the statue created by Max Klinger for the 1902 exhibit of the Succession artists in Vienna. It portrays Beethoven as an ancient Greek deity seated on a throne draped by a cloth. An eagle before him recoils from the projected aura of intensity. Here's a picture of that. For you audience listeners, it kind of looks like one of those like marble statues that you would think of from like classical antiquity and stuff. But it is kind of strange to see that it's freaking Beethoven. You know, it's not some Greek god or something. You know, of this type of stuff with such nice. You know, it's nice when you got some rock that looks like cloth. That always takes a lot of skill. And yeah, it kind of looks like Beethoven is kind of put up to this deity level based on that statue. The music itself was monumentalized in an edition of the composer's complete works published by Breitkopf and Hartel between 1862 and 1865 in some 25 oversized volumes. Musicians, critics, and historians now had access in a single place to almost everything Beethoven had written. Biographies followed in great number, and scholars began to decipher the hieroglyphic sketchbooks in an attempt to understand the utterances of a figure they regarded increasingly as a musical sphinx. The call to Beethoven in German-speaking lands was more than just musical. It carried significant political and nationalistic overtones. His works provided the repertorial backbone of the massive music festivals that proliferated in the middle of the 19th century. The performers were at first largely amateurs, and for this reason, the gatherings carried all the more powerful political overtones. For large public assemblies were otherwise severely restricted at the time. Wolfgang Robert Griepenkerl's 1838 novella Das Musikfest oder die Beethovener, translated as The Music Festival or The Beethovenians, takes place against the backdrop of one such festival whose centerpiece is the Ninth Symphony. Musical political conservatives plot against its performance and succeed in repressing this revolutionary music with its message of brotherhood and social equality. The centenary of the composer's birth in 1870 fell in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War, when German nationalism was approaching new heights, and Beethoven, or rather, quote-unquote, Beethoven, provided the ideal cultural icon. Wagner's, I think he did that, basically saying like it wasn't just Beethoven, but the idea of Beethoven, the scowl and all that, and that took on some nationalistic pride. Wagner's widely read essay marking the event centers on the composer's Germanness at a time when the nation-state of Germany, long an ideal, was on the cusp of becoming a reality. Such aggressive claims of culture would only intensify in the decades that followed, culminating in the appropriation of Beethoven's art by the Nazi regime in 1933-45. The Third Reich used his works widely in its political rituals and propaganda films. Paradoxically, the Allies co-opted his music to rally hearts and minds to their own cause. The opening rhythm of the Fifth Symphony, Morse code for the letter V, became the sonic icon for V for victory. So da 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 is Morse for V. From the extreme right to the extreme left, political ideologies of every stripe had laid claim to Beethoven. Communist regimes of the Cold War era pointed to his message of egalitarianism. During the 1970 bicentennial celebrations, Willi Stoph, the de facto head of East German state, declared that Beethoven's music, quote, culminates in the future image of a creative society freed from exploitation and repression, end quote. The ideas that he, quote, shaped musically in his compositions, end quote, would ultimately be realized as the victorious struggle of the working class in a socialist society. The West, Stoff maintained, had sought to remove the connection between Beethoven and the Volk, exploiting his music for purely commercial gain and ignoring the social implications of his creations. Celebrations in the West, by contrast, emphasized the universality of Beethoven's music. In 1972, the Council of Europe adopted the melody of the Ninth Symphony's Ode to Joy as its wordless anthem, and it serves the same function today for that organizer's successor, the European Union. The Ninth has become an icon of freedom in recent decades. Chilean women sang the Ode to Joy melody outside the prisons where their husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons were incarcerated during the era of Augusto Pinochet's repressive regime of the 1970s and 80s. Leonard Bernstein conducted the Ninth in Berlin shortly after the fall of the wall in late 1989, substituting Freiheit, freedom, to Freud, joy, in the finale. The idea goes back to an urban legend of sorts that began to circulate after Beethoven's time, that Schiller's joy was in fact a code word for freedom. So that's interesting, right? It's like some people thought that Beethoven's music made us equal people, but on the other hand, it seemed like there's a similar but different idea that Beethoven's music was ready to be enjoyed by anybody, right? A lot of cool stuff right there. That same year, students protesting in Beijing's Tiananmen Square played the Ode to Joy over loudspeakers to drown out government broadcasts. 6 years later, the same government that had been under assault by those protesters hosted the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, and the event's opening ceremony included a 126-piece all-female orchestra and workers' chorus performing the Ninth. Hypocrisy! In Japan, group participation is paramount. Performances by choruses of thousands are regular occurrences, especially around New Year's. Audience members often join in the singing as well, creating what one journalist has dubbed transcendental karaoke. Not all responses to the Ninth have been so positive. Some find its optimism oppressive. Quote, "Those who choose Elysium," as Beethoven biographer Maynard Solomon observed, yield up their individuality to the group. And the massed choral portions of Beethoven's setting reinforce this impression for, quote, "Fraternity is intolerable of indifference." In Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange and Stanley Kubrick's movie version of the novel, the Ninth becomes an instrument of violence, torture, and repression. Pushback against quote-unquote Beethoven has been strongest around the time of anniversaries. The decade of the 1920s, with its double commemorations of 1920 and 1927, witnessed a turn toward expresses objectivity in all the arts, including music, which led Hermann Albert, one of the leading music historians of his generation, to observe that, quote, "An exasperated attitude toward Beethoven is now making itself felt among younger persons. They find his pathos oppressive, exaggerated, even intolerable. They consider his pointed subjectivity a downright calamity for the art." End quote. The bicentennial celebrations of 1970 elicited even sharper critical responses. The meta-collage Ludwig van by the Argentinian composer Mauricio Kagel proved especially controversial. The score consists of fragments literally cut and pasted from Beethoven's published works. Any number of musicians can realize Kagel's piece by playing any portions of it they wish on an instrument of their choice, in any order and in any combination. The effect is to defamiliarize the music. We hear snippets of works we know in entirely new contexts, timbres, and combinations. Intentional but unprescribed distortions of volume, tempo, and timbre enhance the sense of an alienation. Quote, the music of the past, as Kagel noted, should also be performed as music of the present. His surreal black and white film of the same name, also from 1970, is an overt critique of the contemporary culture industry and its objectification of Beethoven and his music. Scowling busts play a prominent role. The challenge of making Beethoven sound fresh lies at the heart of the Norwegian sound artist Leif Inge's 9-bait stretch, which elongates a single recording of the Ninth Symphony over a span of 24 hours without any distortion of pitch. The first movement runs about 5.5 hours, the final 8.5. The finale lasts for 8.5. For those who have the time, it is indeed revelatory. Anyone who has heard the open fifths at the very beginning in slow motion will likely hear any subsequent normal performances quite differently. Performers continue to wrestle with Beethoven at times, almost literally. At the Ojai Festival in California in June 2018, the violinist Patricia Kopachinskaya presented a program entitled Bye Bye Beethoven, which ended with a deconstruction of the violin concerto. The orchestra musicians began to leave the stage shortly before the end of the finale, knocking over their stands in the process as if in protest. And the soloist, who had soldiered bravely on alone, crumpled to the floor before finishing, drowned out by a grotesquely amplified and intentionally distorted Beethovenian mashup. The music had collapsed, in effect, under the weight of its own tradition. In the meantime, Beethoven's hold on popular culture continues unabated. Of memorabilia there is no end. The collection of the Bibliotheca Beethoveniana in Muggia, Italy, houses more than 11,000 items that range from sculptures and paintings to advertisements, postage stamps, medals, coins, pins, lamps, neckties, wine bottles, pipes, and matchboxes. Filmmakers recognized Beethoven's potential early on. The composer's love life was the focus of the Austrian silent film Der Martyrer seines Herzens, The Martyr of His Heart. And in 1920, Bell and Howell produced a short silent film entitled Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, in which the composer overhears a young woman playing his music on the piano and offers to play for her himself. Quote, "Snuff the candles and I will improvise for her in the moonlight," he declares. With the house lights turned down, and the theater organist would no doubt have supplied the necessary music to extend well beyond the film's 3 minutes. More extended biopics soon followed, most notably Un Grand Amour de Beethoven, A Great Love of Beethoven, directed by Abel Gance, again focusing on the composer's love life, as does Immortal Beloved in 1994, which is apparently about his cousin or something. As you said before, one prominent online database lists more than 1,000 films, documentaries, or television productions that use the composer's music in their soundtracks. Beethoven can be a presence even when we don't hear him. A camera sweep of Norman Bates's bedroom in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho reveals that this decidedly unheroic character has been listening to a recording of the Eroica. Songwriters, in turn, have mined Beethoven's catalog repeatedly. Walter Murphy reworked the opening of the Fifth Symphony into his Fifth of Beethoven, which figured prominently a year later in the soundtrack of the film Saturday Night Fever. In Questions, 1976, Manfred Mann adds words to a rather less than known but no less arresting source, the slow movement of the Violin Sonata in C minor, Opus 30, No. 2. Billy Joel underlaid a text to the slow movement of the Pathétique Sonata to create the song This Night. The rapper Nas sampled the Bagatelle in A minor, Woo 59, called For Elise, in his I Can song in 2003. And Alicia Keys drew on the opening movement of the Moonlight Sonata for her Piano and I song. What might Beethoven have thought of all this? He has in fact sanctioned a reworking of the slow movement of his Piano Sonata Opus 2 No. 1 in 1807 as a song, with a text by his lifelong friend Wegler. Quote, "My happiness has disappeared, my peace is gone." As to performances that seek to transform his music more radically, let us not forget Czerny's account of Beethoven moving his listeners to tears through his keyboard improvisation and then mocking those tears as soon as he stopped playing. Beethoven could reflect on his own art from multiple perspectives. Listeners across the globe have done so as well. The appeal of Beethoven's music transcends differences in race, nationality, creed, age, and sex. That dubious cliche about music being the universal language, as Leonard Bernstein observed in 1970, almost comes true with Beethoven. No composer who has ever lived speaks so directly to so many people. End quote. His music is profound yet approachable. It draws us in even while challenging us. We hear in it something that captures the human condition in ways that words and visual images cannot. Our responses are for that very reason all the more visceral and profound. Beethoven had every reason to portray himself as a modern-day Orpheus, that mythic musician whose art was so magical that allowed him to move back and forth between the worlds of the living and the dead. Beethoven's music helps us understand and even believe the core element of that myth, the power of music. That's it. The rest is all just like citations and such, which is kind of funny. I feel like I skipped a chapter or something because I swear there was something that I missed related to something related to the Czerny guy, because there was a story where in the Third Symphony Movement 1, towards the end, one of the French horns comes in early, or was it a trombone player? It's one of those where it's like and then it goes back to where it was. And Czerny came out to Beethoven and was like, "I'm so sorry about that player. He came in early. We'll fire him immediately. It's okay." And Beethoven turned around and he's like, "No, he did exactly what I wanted him to." So some of his like jokes were hard to understand even by his star pupil, right? So that's a little story of Beethoven, I know, I guess. But isn't that great? It's just like 12 chapters where we go through Beethoven's life multiple times from different perspectives, just like I think that's what the author intended to do. So trying to think of what to read next. I looked through the Schindler. They say that Schindler had an account that he was friends with Beethoven for a while. I looked at that. That is very, very, very long. And it compiles a lot of these letters that apparently Schindler knew about. I was gonna read that to see, how fictional that was, but it's so long. It will be hard to figure that out. But I think I'm gonna pick another book for us to read related to music. Maybe a good one about Bach or something. Um, so stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this audiobook of Beethoven Variations on a Life. All right, y'all. That's it for now. Your boy JY out.